There is a silent disease that spreads through modern civilization like an invisible plague, consuming souls from within, while society applauds its victims as exemplary citizens. This illness has no obvious physical symptoms in its early stages, does not show up in blood tests, or can be diagnosed by MRI scans, but Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian seer whose insights penetrated the hidden depths of human existence, identified it with surgical precision more than a century ago. He watched with growing concern how the industrial age was transforming human beings into biological machines, reducing the infinite complexity of the human soul to a single function: economic productivity. Steiner saw clearly that when a person lives exclusively to work, when his complete identity merges with his professional occupation, when every waking thought revolves around tasks, deadlines, and work obligations, something essential within him begins to wither and die. Not the physical body, although it certainly suffers eventually, but the soul itself, that sacred dimension of the human being that connects the earthly to the heavenly, the temporal to the eternal. It sickens the soul. And a sick soul, Steiner warned, is more dangerous than any physical illness, because a person with a sick soul walks through the world like an undead, functioning mechanically, but devoid of the divine spark that constitutes true humanity. This condition not only destroys the individual, but contaminates everything around them, creating empty relationships, soulless societies, and an entire civilization that has lost touch with the sacred. Rudolf Steiner was not a simple theoretical philosopher weaving comfortable abstractions from an academic ivory tower. He was a trained clairvoyant, someone whose perception penetrated through the veils of physical matter to directly observe the spiritual realities that underpin human existence. When Steiner talked about the human soul, he was not speculating or using poetic metaphors. He was describing what he saw clearly with his developed spiritual senses: a complex organism of life forces, etheric and astral bodies, structures of thought and feeling that exist as truly as the physical body, only in finer dimensions of reality. And what he observed at the beginning of the 20th century alarmed him deeply. Steiner saw workers emerging from factories with their etheric bodies damaged, their vital forces exhausted not only by physical exertion, but by the spiritual monotony of mechanized labor. He saw office workers whose astral bodies were atrophying because their entire emotional lives were suppressed during long hours of repetitive work. He saw executives and business people whose higher selves, that spark of divine individuality that constitutes the unique essence of every human being, were being buried beneath layers of professional identity until there was nothing left of the real person but the social mask of the occupational role. Steiner understood that modern civilization was creating conditions that were systematically destroying humanity's spiritual health, and he devoted decades of teaching to warning about the dangers of this trajectory. Anthroposophy, the system of spiritual knowledge that Steiner developed, offers a deep understanding of the human makeup that illuminates why living only to work is so destructive. According to Steiner, the human being is not a simple unit, but a complex composition of multiple dimensions that must all be nourished and balanced for the person to achieve full health. There is the physical body, that visible material structure that we share with the mineral kingdom. There is the etheric or vital body, that matrix of vital forces that animates the physical and that we share with the vegetable kingdom. There's the astral body, the carrier of our emotional and sensory life that we share with the animal kingdom. And there's the ego or higher self, that spark of divine self-awareness that is unique to humanity and that empowers us for self-determination, freedom, and conscious evolution. Each of these dimensions has specific needs that must be met for the person to maintain integrity and health. The physical body needs nutrition, rest, and appropriate exercise. The etheric body needs a healthy rhythm, connection with natural processes, time for regeneration. The astral body needs beauty, art, rich emotional experiences, creative expression. The higher self needs meaningful purpose, moral development, connection to the spiritual, opportunities for conscious growth and self-transformation. When a person lives exclusively to work, especially in the type of mechanized work that dominates modern civilization, most of these needs are systematically neglected. Modern work, particularly in industrialized and post-industrial economies, it has been structured in ways that profoundly violate the needs of the complete human constitution. Steiner observed that factory work, with its extreme division of tasks and endless repetition of fragmented movements, completely impedes the healthy development of the human being. When a worker spends 8, 10, 12 hours a day repeating exactly the same mechanical movements, something terrible happens in its subtle dimensions. The etheric body, which thrives on natural rhythms and organic variation, is forced into rigid, unnatural patterns that progressively exhaust it. The astral body, which craves rich emotional experiences and creative expression, is systematically repressed and eventually atrophies like an unused muscle. The higher self, which seeks meaning, purpose, and opportunities for conscious growth, is is completely ignored, as mechanized work neither requires nor allows for any involvement of one's true individuality. The person literally becomes a cog in a machine, and their essential humanity is gradually crushed under the weight of economic needs that do not recognize the human soul. Steiner saw workers returning home at night so exhausted in their subtle bodies that they had no energy for any cultural, social, or spiritual activity. They ate, slept, and returned to the factory, in a cycle that progressively reduced them from complete human beings to mere instruments of economic production. But Steiner also recognized that the problem was not limited to manual labor in factories. The professional and managerial class faced their own forms of work-related spiritual illness. The executive, who devotes 70 hours a week to his career, whose thoughts constantly revolve around business strategies, sales quotas, and financial reports, is as spiritually ill as the factory worker, just in different ways. This executive may appear successful on the outside, may accumulate wealth and social status, but on the inside, he is emptying himself. Your astral body becomes arid because all your emotions are channeled into professional ambitions, leaving nothing for personal relationships, appreciation of beauty, or simple joy. His higher self is stifled because he identifies completely with his professional role, forgetting that he is an eternal soul only temporarily occupying a specific position in the economic hierarchy. Steiner observed that these people often experience profound existential crises later in life when they realize that they have dedicated entire decades to pursuing goals that ultimately have no real meaning or durability. They built professional empires but completely neglected the development of their essential humanity. And unlike spiritual achievements, which the soul carries through death and into future incarnations, material and professional successes are completely abandoned when the physical body perishes. The human soul needs variety, rhythm, and balance to maintain health. Steiner taught that there is profound wisdom in the natural rhythms that govern life. The daily rhythm of activity and rest, the weekly rhythm that, in many traditions, includes a day dedicated to the spiritual, the seasonal rhythms that bring different qualities of experience throughout the year, the rhythms of life of the different phases of human existence. Modern civilization, with its obsession with constant productivity and incessant economic growth, violates all of these natural rhythms. Factories operate 24 hours a day. Offices expect employees to be available at any time through communication technologies that eliminate all boundaries between work and personal life. The global economy never sleeps, and those who work within it are forced to synchronize with artificial rhythms that bear no relationship to the real needs of the human constitution. Steiner warned that this violation of natural rhythms produces devastating consequences for spiritual health. When there is no time for genuine rest, the etheric body cannot regenerate properly. When there is no time for cultural and artistic activities, the astral body wastes away. When there is no time for contemplation and spiritual development, the higher self remains dormant, and the person lives a subhuman existence, functioning only through his lower dimensions that he shares with plants and animals. Complete identification with one's professional role is one of the most dangerous spiritual illnesses of the modern era. Steiner noted that many people respond to the question, "Who are you?" with your occupation, "I'm an engineer, I'm a teacher, I'm a manager." This response reveals a deep confusion about the nature of human identity. You are not your profession. Your profession is something you do temporarily for a small fraction of your eternal existence. The true you is a unique spiritual individuality that existed before you were born into this body, that will continue to exist after this body dies, that has lived many previous lives and will live many future lives, that possesses unlimited potentials for development and transformation. When you reduce this infinite vastness to a single temporary social role, you commit spiritual violence against yourself. Steiner saw that this excessive identification with professional roles produces terrible consequences when the person loses their job, retires, or for any reason can no longer perform that role. If you believe it's your job, then when the job disappears, you literally lose your sense of who you are. This explains why so many retirees experience deep depression and rapid decline in health. It's not simply because they are bored or lack structure. It's because their entire identity was invested in their professional role, and without it, they don't know who they are. The healthy soul maintains a clear separation between the eternal self and the temporary roles it plays in life, allowing it to fully engage in meaningful work without losing itself in it. Steiner also warned about how excessive work destroys the capacity for authentic relationships. The human soul is fundamentally relational. We evolve through encounters with other souls, through love, friendship, creative collaboration, conflict, and reconciliation. Genuine relationships require presence, time, emotional energy, vulnerability. When a person dedicates all their energy to work, there's nothing left to offer others. She comes home exhausted, unable to meaningfully engage with partners, children, friends. Conversations become superficial because all the depth of the person is being drained at work. Emotional intimacy becomes impossible because all emotions are being invested in professional drama. This sickens the soul, not just of the working person, but of everyone around them. Children grow up feeling like they are less important than their parents' careers. Partners feel neglected and invisible. Friendships wither because there is no time or energy to nurture them. Steiner saw these relational consequences as symptoms of a deeper spiritual illness. A person who can no longer connect authentically with other human souls is missing a fundamental capacity that defines humanity, and a society made up of individuals so isolated in their professional ambitions becomes a spiritual desert where everyone is alone, surrounded by others but incapable of true encounter. Loss of connection with nature is another devastating consequence of living just to work. Steiner taught that human beings are not separate from nature but are an integral part of it, and that our spiritual health depends on maintaining conscious connection with the natural realms. The human etheric body resonates with the Earth's etheric body, renewing itself through exposure to natural processes: sunlight, fresh air, running water, plant growth, the cycles of the seasons. When a person spends their entire life in artificial environments, air-conditioned offices, closed factories, motor vehicles, they lose this vital connection. The etheric body begins to wither like a plant deprived of sunlight. Steiner observed that urban workers in the industrial era suffered from a form of spiritual anemia, a loss of vitality that no amount of physical nutrition could restore because the cause was separation from natural sources of vital energy. He strongly recommended that people, especially those involved in intense mental work or physical work in unnatural environments, devote regular time to being in nature, not merely as physical exercise, but as a conscious spiritual practice of reconnecting with the life forces of the earth. A mindful walk through a forest, meditative observation of a garden, time spent near running water, these experiences are not optional luxuries, but spiritual necessities, as important as physical nourishment. The impoverishment of cultural life is both a cause and a consequence of living just to work. Steiner devoted enormous efforts to renewing the arts and culture because he understood that they are essential nourishment for the astral body and higher self. When a person experiences great art, music, drama, poetry, sublime architecture, something profound happens in its subtle dimensions. The astral body is elevated, refined, expanded. The higher self is awakened and stimulated in directions of growth and transformation. Genuine cultural experience is not entertainment active, but active participation in spiritual realities that artists manage to make visible, audible, tangible. However, the person who lives only to work does not have the time, energy, or capacity to truly engage with art. She may consume superficial entertainment as a distraction after exhausting days at work, but that is not the same as authentic cultural experience. Modern commercial entertainment is designed to demand nothing from the viewer, to allow completely passive consumption that neither challenges nor transforms. True art, on the contrary, requires active participation, emotional openness, engagement of imagination and intelligence. It requires you to bring your full humanity to the encounter. A person exhausted by overwork cannot do this, and so a vicious cycle is created. Excessive work prevents cultural engagement. The lack of cultural nutrition impoverishes the soul. The impoverished soul becomes less capable of recognizing the emptiness of a life dedicated only to work. Steiner was particularly concerned about the effect of obsessive work on the capacity for free and creative thought. He taught that genuine human thought is a spiritual activity that connects the individual with higher realities. When we truly think, we are not just manipulating concepts in our brains, we are participating in cosmic intelligences, connecting with the logos, the principle of wisdom that permeates the universe. But the thinking required by most modern occupations is not free thinking in this high sense. It is instrumental thinking, thinking that serves external purposes, thinking that is a tool for achieving practical goals. The engineer thinks about how to build more efficient structures. The accountant thinks about how to optimize tax returns. The manager thinks about how to increase productivity. All this thinking is tied to the practical objectives of the work. He has no internal freedom. He does not explore fundamental questions about reality, meaning purpose. A person can be extremely intelligent in his professional field while remaining completely undeveloped in his capacity for philosophical thought, spiritual contemplation, investigation of the great questions of existence. Steiner warned that a civilization made up of brilliant experts who never think about anything beyond their specialties is a civilization that has lost touch with wisdom, and that such a civilization will eventually destroy itself through its own one-dimensional intelligence. The problem of excessive specialization is closely related to that of living just to work. The modern economy requires increasingly narrow specialization. A person spends decades becoming an expert in a tiny field of knowledge or skill, often so specific that only a few hundred people in the entire world understand it. This specialization brings obvious economic benefits, enabling efficiency and innovation in technical areas, But Steiner saw the spiritual costs as devastating. The human being is destined to develop fully and integrally, engaging with the entirety of the human experience, not just a tiny fragment of it. When a person becomes so specialized that their entire identity and capabilities are invested in a narrow area of expertise, they become a diminished version of a human being. Steiner compared this to an orchestra where each musician only knows how to play one note. Technically, you could create music with such an orchestra, but what kind of music would it be, and what kind of experience would it be for the musicians? Healthy human development requires breadth as well as depth. It requires us to cultivate many different capacities, to engage with many areas of life and knowledge. The Renaissance produced magnificently developed individuals like Leonardo da Vinci precisely because their culture did not force extreme premature specialization. A Renaissance young man could study art, science, philosophy, music, literature, all as parts of a well-rounded education. Modern civilization has sacrificed this integrality on the altar of economic efficiency. The question of meaning is central to understanding why living just to work sickens the soul. Steiner taught that the human higher self needs meaning like the physical body needs air. We cannot survive spiritually in a vacuum of meaning. We need to feel that our lives matter, that our actions have purpose, that we are contributing to something bigger than ourselves. Work can provide some meaning, especially if it is work that clearly benefits others or contributes to worthwhile goals. But work alone, especially work whose sole purpose is to generate profit for distant shareholders, can never provide itself sufficient knowledge to satisfy the deep needs of the human soul. Steiner saw many modern workers living in quiet desperation because they dedicated their lives to activities that had no real meaning beyond economic survival. They worked to make money to pay bills, to keep working, to make money to pay bills in an endless cycle that went nowhere. This absence of transcendent meaning corrodes the soul from the inside out. The person can function, can fulfill his obligations, but inside he is dead. Steiner contrasted this with earlier times when work was integrated into broader contexts of meaning. The medieval craftsman who created stained glass for a cathedral was engaged in work that had clear spiritual significance. He was contributing to creating a sacred space that would uplift the souls of countless future generations. This sense of participating in something sacred and lasting nourished his soul even through difficult physical work. Modern technology has created unprecedented possibilities for both liberation and spiritual enslavement. Steiner lived at the beginning of the technological era and clearly saw both potentialities. Technology could free humans from crushing physical toil, creating time and energy for cultural and spiritual development. Or it could become a new form of slavery even more insidious than previous forms, because it would be voluntary and invisible. Steiner saw disturbing signs that civilization was choosing the second path. Technology was being used not to liberate humanity, but to intensify exploitation, allowing work to invade every moment of life through constant communication, productivity to be increased indefinitely through relentless monitoring and optimization. He would have been horrified but not surprised to see how smartphones and the internet have allowed work to follow people into their homes, their weekends, their vacations, their beds. The boundary between work and non-work, which was once maintained by the simple impossibility of continuing to work once you physically left the workplace, has completely dissolved. Now you're expected to check emails at 11 at night, answer messages during family dinners, be available to your employer 24 hours a day. This sickens the soul in ways that Steiner predicted, but that we still don't fully understand, because we are just beginning to see the consequences on a civilizational scale. The loss of time for contemplation and introspection is one of the most destructive dimensions of living just to work. Steiner taught that spiritual development requires regular practice of contemplation, meditation, and self-examination. Without time to turn inward, to observe one's own thought and feeling processes, to question one's motivations and actions, to consciously connect with higher dimensions of being, one remains spiritually unconscious. She lives entirely on the surface of existence, reacting to external stimuli but never touching the depths of her own nature. Modern work, with its incessant demands for external attention, makes it practically impossible to maintain a contemplative life. There's always one more email to answer, one more task to complete, one more meeting to attend. The mind is constantly turned outward, pursuing external goals, never resting in the stillness where deeper realities can reveal themselves. Steiner recommended that everyone devote at least a few minutes daily to specific meditative exercises, but recognized that for many modern workers, even this seemed impossible. They were so exhausted by the end of the workday that falling into a mindless sleep was all they could do. And so they spent entire lives without ever really knowing themselves, without ever exploring the depths of their own consciousness, without ever developing the latent capacities for spiritual perception that every human being possesses. The disease of the soul caused by living only to work not only affects the individual, but spreads throughout society. A society made up of individuals with sick souls becomes a sick society itself. Steiner observed signs of this collective illness everywhere in his time, and they have only intensified in the centuries since. A society where everyone lives only to work is a society that has lost the capacity for genuine celebration, for spontaneous joy. Festivities become commercialized and empty because no one has the emotional energy to invest in them authentically. It is a society that loses interest in art, philosophy, genuine religion, all dimensions of human culture that do not directly contribute to economic productivity. It is a society that becomes progressively more brutal and inhumane because its institutions are designed to maximize efficiency without regard for spiritual needs. It is a society that destroys its natural environment because nature is seen only as a resource for economic exploitation, not as something with intrinsic value or as a necessary source of spiritual renewal. It is a society that creates increasingly powerful technologies while losing the wisdom to use them appropriately because technological development continues while spiritual development stagnates. Steiner warned that such a society is on a path to self-destruction, not necessarily through a single catastrophic event, but through the gradual degradation of everything that makes human life worth living. The alternative that Steiner proposed was not to reject work completely, nor to romanticize poverty. He recognized that work is necessary and can be ennobling when properly integrated into a balanced life. What he advocated was a radical transformation in how we think about work and its relationship to the rest of human existence. First, work should never consume a person's entire life. There should be abundant time for rest, relationships, cultural activities, spiritual development. Steiner argued that in a rationally organized society, only a few hours of daily work would be needed to produce everything necessary for a comfortable material life, freeing the rest of the time for higher activities. Second, work should be meaningful, should clearly contribute to human well-being or worthwhile goals. People should not be forced to spend their lives in soul-destroying work just to survive economically. Third, education should prepare people, not primarily for specific economic roles, but for the full development of all human capabilities. The Waldorf pedagogy that Steiner developed was based on this principle, seeking to nurture the whole child, body, soul, and spirit, not produce efficient workers for the economy. Fourth, society should be reorganized so that economic, political, and cultural needs are met by separate and autonomous spheres, not all subordinated to economic logic. His idea of social trimembration sought to create conditions where cultural and spiritual life could flourish freely without being distorted by economic or political forces. Healing a soul sickened by excessive work is possible, but requires conscious effort and courage. It's not simply a matter of taking more vacations or practicing stress management techniques. It requires fundamental transformation in how you relate to work and your own identity. First, you must break the identification between your true self and your professional role. This means consciously cultivating aspects of yourself that are unrelated to work, developing interests, relationships, capabilities that exist completely outside the professional sphere. It means practicing saying, I work as an engineer, instead of, I am an engineer, maintaining clear separation between what you do temporarily and who you are eternally. Second, you must establish firm boundaries between work and non-work, creating sacred times and spaces that work cannot invade. This may require difficult choices, may even mean sacrificing professional advancement to protect your spiritual integrity. Third, you must cultivate regular practices that nourish the dimensions of your being that work neglects. This means time in nature, engagement with art, meditation or prayer, contemplative reading, deep conversations, any activities that connect you with realities beyond the material and pragmatic. Fourth, you must seek or create work that has genuine meaning, that contributes to something you value, that utilizes your highest capabilities, not just your technical skills. Steiner also offered specific exercises to strengthen the soul against the destructive effects of modern work. He recommended simple but powerful meditative practices that anyone could incorporate into their daily life, even those with demanding work schedules. A fundamental exercise involves setting aside 5 minutes in the morning for calm contemplation of a simple object, a flower or crystal or piece of art, learning to observe it with complete attention without discursive thoughts, thus developing the capacity for meditative concentration that strengthens the higher self. Another exercise involved retrospective review at the end of the day, where you mentally relive the day's events in reverse order from most recent to oldest, thus developing the ability to objectively observe things, your own life without excessive emotional identification. He recommended practicing artistic exercises such as drawing, painting, music, or eurythmy, not to become proficient, but to awaken creative capacities of the astral body that ordinary work leaves dormant. He emphasized the importance of studying spiritual material not as an accumulation of information, but as active meditation on ideas that elevate consciousness beyond the ordinary. All of these practices, when done consistently, begin to heal the spiritual damage caused by excessive immersion in work. The social dimension of healing is equally important. An individual person can make changes in their own life, but as long as entire social structures force living only to work, the problem will continue on a massive scale. Steiner believed that genuine social transformation is possible, but it requires that enough people awaken to spiritual realities and begin to demand change. This means challenging fundamental economic assumptions of modern civilization, questioning whether infinite economic growth is really desirable, whether maximized productivity is really society's highest goal, whether forcing people to dedicate the majority of their lives to work is really necessary, or just an arrangement that benefits a small minority at the expense of everyone else. It means creating alternative communities and ways of life that demonstrate different possibilities. It means supporting movements for shorter working hours, basic income, reorganization of the economy to prioritize human well-being over profit. It means recognizing that economic issues are fundamentally spiritual issues, because the kind of economy we create determines the kind of lives we can live and the kind of human beings we can become. The urgency of Steiner's warning has only become more intense in the century since he articulated it. The forces he saw beginning to dominate civilization intensified exponentially. Work invaded every aspect of life much more completely than he could have imagined. The identification of human identity with an economic function has become almost total. The pace of life has accelerated to the point where many people feel like they are running faster and faster, just to stay in the same place. Nature is being destroyed on a scale that threatens the very possibility of continued civilization. Culture is fragmenting into commercialized entertainment and passive consumption. Spiritual life is being forgotten by vast portions of humanity. And yet, precisely because the crisis has intensified so much, more people are beginning to wake up to it. There is growing recognition that something is deeply wrong with how we organize our lives, that the old model of dedicating everything to work and career is not working, that we are sacrificing our humanity on altars of productivity and efficiency that do not deserve such a sacrifice. This awakening is the first step towards healing. It sickens the soul. These words should echo in the consciousness of every person who feels their life being consumed by work, every person who notices that weeks pass without a moment of true stillness or joy, every person who recognizes that they are only living partially, that entire dimensions of their being are being neglected and stunted. The illness of the soul is not metaphorical. It is real, perhaps more real than physical illnesses, because it affects deeper dimensions of your being. And while sick physical body eventually dies and sets you free, sick soul carries its infirmities through death and into future incarnations. The standards you establish in this life, the capabilities you develop or neglect, the relationships you create with work, nature, other human beings, culture, spirit, all form the substance of who you will be in future lives. If you allow this life to be completely consumed by work, if you never develop the higher dimensions of your being, if you allow your soul to wither in disease, you not only lose the possibilities of this present incarnation, but you mortgage your spiritual future. Steiner saw this clearly, and that was why he warned so urgently about the dangers. He was not only concerned with the happiness or comfort of people in their present lives, but with the evolutionary destiny of humanity through future ages. The choice before each person is clear, even when circumstances make it difficult. You can continue on the path of living only to work, allowing your soul to progressively wither away until you become an empty shell moving through meaningless routines. Or you can begin, even in small ways, to reclaim your full humanity, to nurture the dimensions of your being that work neglects, to create spaces in your life where soul can breathe and grow. This last choice may require sacrifices. It can mean making less money, advancing more slowly in your career, being seen as less ambitious or dedicated by colleagues and superiors. But the alternative is to sacrifice your soul, trade your eternal humanity for temporal success, sell your spiritual birthright for a bowl of economic lentils. Seen from the broad spiritual perspective that Steiner invites us to adopt, the choice is obvious. No amount of professional success, no accumulation of material wealth, no achievement in the economic realm is worth the loss of your soul. And yet, billions of people make exactly this trade-off. Not because they are stupid or evil, but because they are trapped in systems that make it extremely difficult to choose otherwise, and because they have lost touch with the spiritual realities that would make the true cost of their choices visible. The path forward requires both individual and social transformation. Individually, each person must make conscious choices to protect and nurture their soul, to resist the pressure to reduce themselves to economic instruments, to insist on their full humanity, even when social systems deny it. Socially, We must work together to create conditions where healthy, fulfilling human life is possible for everyone, not just the privileged few who can choose not to work or work less. This means transforming economic institutions, educational systems, political arrangements, entire culture. It is a huge task, the work of generations. But, as Steiner repeatedly emphasized, each person who awakens and begins to live differently contributes to the transformation of the whole. You don't need to wait for society to change before you start healing your own soul. And, as more individuals awaken and change their lives, eventually critical mass is reached and social transformation becomes possible. Human history is driven by such awakenings. Entire epochs change when enough people recognize that old ways of life are no longer working and begin to imagine and create alternatives. Steiner viewed the future of humanity with fundamental hope, despite his clear perception of the dangers. He believed that human consciousness is evolving toward higher levels of spiritual perception, that more people are beginning to awaken to dimensions of reality beyond the physical material, that eventually humanity will reach the point where life will be consciously organized according to spiritual truths rather than being driven by unconscious materialistic forces. But he also saw that this evolution is neither automatic nor guaranteed. It requires conscious effort, correct choices, a willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for higher goals. The issue of work is central to this evolution because it determines whether we will have time, energy, and capacity for spiritual development, or whether we will remain trapped in a purely material existence. A civilization where everyone lives only to work is a civilization that has stagnated spiritually, which can develop technologically but remains primitive in terms of consciousness. A civilization that frees people from excessive toil and creates conditions for cultural and spiritual flourishing is a civilization that can evolve toward higher forms of human existence. The choice between these futures is being made now, through millions of individual choices about how to live, and through collective decisions about how to organize society. Steiner's warning about living only to work is finally a wake-up call. It is an invitation to recognize that you are more than a worker, more than an economic function, more than a social role. You are an eternal soul on an evolutionary journey through multiple incarnations, a spiritual being temporarily inhabiting a physical body, a spark of divine consciousness destined eventually to consciously reunite with its source. This present life is a precious brief moment on this eternal journey, an opportunity to develop capabilities that you will carry with you through death, to form relationships that will continue in future lives, to learn lessons that will accelerate your evolution. Don't waste this opportunity by letting work consume everything. Do not allow your soul to become sick through neglect. Do not allow blind economic forces to reduce you to an instrument of production. Reclaim your complete humanity. Nourish all dimensions of your being. Live with the awareness that you are much vaster than the temporary circumstances of this singular life. And in doing so, you not only heal your own soul, but contribute to the healing of an entire civilization. For the world changes when people change, and people change when they awaken to who they really are beyond all temporary social roles and identities. This Des understanding is possible for you now, in this moment, if you choose to heed Steiner's warning and begin to live in accordance with truths he saw so clearly, that the human soul is sacred, that human life must be lived fully in all its dimensions, and that no amount of material success is worth the price of neglecting the spiritual realities that constitute our true essence and our eternal destiny.